World life, world life.
I have a very special privilege of welcoming all of you to this public session on President Obama's visit and Indo-US relations. And the level of interest in the US relationship is so high. As you can see, members of the panel, especially the American members of the panel, the house is full, and I hope we will get some more chairs in so that people don't have to stand. This amazing high-quality panel is available to us today because over the next couple of days, we have the US-India Strategic Dialogue meeting, the Track 2 meeting, which has been in operation since exactly 10 years. And Professor Joe Nye, who's in the center, with spectacles on, to be distinguished from Nick Burns, the chair and moderator, has been the constant chair of this dialogue since that time. So let's give him a big hand. The US-India dialogue was the first that we got involved in, but it has spawned similar dialogues with several other countries: Singapore, Turkey, China, Japan, and equally important, a trilateral dialogue between US, Japan, and India, and a US-India climate change dialogue. I just want to give you a sense of the multiple engagements that are happening now between India and other countries on the Track 2 level. Now with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Nick Burns, the distinguished moderator and chair for this session. Nick is a former Undersecretary of State. He's a professor at Harvard now, and the director of the Aspen Strategy Group. Nick.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for all of us who are Americans to be here and to see our Indian friends in this dialogue. President Kennedy used to say that victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. This is a success, this Aspen Indian dialogue. And in addition to Professor Joe Nye and Brent Scowcroft, they're the two Americans who created the Aspen Strategy Group 30 years ago as a nonpartisan effort, and that's saying something in the United States, a nonpartisan effort to think about our biggest foreign policy problems. Taran Das has been one of those fathers of this success on the Indian side, so we have to appropriately thank him. Taran.
Yes.
So what we've been asked to do today is have a conversation about the US-India relationship, and this is the right time to do that, given the fact that Secretary Kerry is going to be here in a couple of days, that President Obama will be here for Republic Day on January 26th, and that is a singular honor for our country, for the United States, and for the President. It's also an opportunity to revive the US-India relationship. And I would think that most of us, whether we're Indian or American, would say that this relationship does need a revival of sorts. We're close friends, but we can certainly have a relationship that's fuller, deeper, pointed forward more than it's been in the last couple of years. And so we thought we'd have a conversation about that today. I'll ask my Indian and American colleagues just a couple of questions, and once we're through pontificating here, we'll throw the microphone to you and ask you to give us your thoughts and ask questions of this panel. We'll go for 90 minutes, and we're very grateful that all of you are here today. I think all of you know the people on this stage, but let me just introduce my Indian colleagues first, beginning with Gautam Thapar, who has been, until recently, the chairman of Aspen India, of Aspen Ananta Center, has been a real fixture in this dialogue for many years. So we welcome Gautam to this panel. My very good and close friend, Shyam Saran, Ambassador Shyam Saran, who chairs the Foreign Policy Advisory Board here, former Foreign Secretary of India, former advisor to the Prime Minister. He and I spent hundreds of hours together negotiating the civil nuclear agreement, which we're going to talk about today. And Ambassador S.K. Lamba, another great friend who's co-chairing the Indian side of our Aspen, India meetings this weekend. Of course, longtime Indian diplomat, great authority on South Asia, on India-Pakistan relations, and much else. And we're very grateful to Ambassador Lamba for being here today. On the American side, Joe Nye is my colleague at Harvard. Joe, as I said, founded the Aspen Strategy Group. We just have celebrated our 30th year with a conference on Russia this past summer in Aspen, Colorado. And Joe's chairing our delegation this time. Brent Scowcroft, his co-chair, could not be with us, but we're in very good hands with Joe. Also here for the American side is Jim Steinberg. Jim is a longtime member of our Aspen Strategy Group, former Deputy Secretary of State for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He was also Deputy National Security Advisor for President Clinton in the Clinton administration. And finally, Ambassador Frank Wisner, who really does not need an introduction here in Delhi, who was a great American ambassador for President Clinton here in the 1990s, an American who knows this country about as well as it can be known, and a great friend of India. So we have got a great delegation. I also just wanted to point out that we have two other American ambassadors to India in our delegation. Ambassador Tim Romer is here today, seated right here in the second row, and we would hope that he would speak up, and I'm sure he will when the Q&A time comes. And Ambassador Bob Blackwell is part of our delegation, couldn't be here today, but will be with us this weekend. So let me start off in advance of our discussions this weekend about this big issue of the future of the U.S.-India relationship. I thought I'd ask Joe Nye and Gautam Thapar the first question, and then I'll have a question for the other two Indian participants and the American participants. But Joe and Gautam, and Joe, we'll start with you. You were present at the creation nearly 13 years ago. The American delegation first came to India to start this Track 2 dialogue, so you can chart the success of this relationship over that time. How have you seen the relationship evolve in those 13 years?
Well, it's interesting to try to recall the atmosphere of February 2002 when we held our first meeting in Udaipur. And it was right after 9/11. And there was a great sense of fear and uncertainty and worry about how the world was evolving, the new types of threat we were facing. And I think it was an interesting chance for Indians and Americans to get together and talk quite frankly about the problems that we faced, which we had in common. If we go back through the 70s and 80s, there have been many instances on which we disagreed on one or another thing, and even before that there was the famous saying of Pat Moynihan, which is that India and America are the two largest democracies, and that makes it easier for them to confuse each other. And so even though we have a lot in common in some ways, we haven't always been able to get the best out of that potential. What's interesting about the meeting that we started this group with, and this is in fact our 20th meeting this weekend, was that a sense of shared threat or shared common concern. And I've argued that even though we have problems from time to time in the U.S.-Indian relationship, I've argued this in print, and I'll say it again at risk today, we are fated to be close allies, never an alliance, nothing formal. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons in both cultures that make that difficult. But if you look at the nature of world politics, we both share at the strategic level some common concerns. One, the most obvious, after this events in Paris yesterday, it's just reminded of this. The Mumbai massacre was a horrible example of it as well. One is, how are we going to deal with this threat of terrorism? Much of it so close to you, but no longer distant from the rest of us, as we've seen. And this is a common problem which we face together. In addition to that, there's a large issue. How are we going to manage the rise of China? Now, I'm not talking about containment of China. We don't want to isolate China. We both have a great deal to profit from good relations with China. But it's also true that we have a common interest in shaping the environment so that China accomplishes what it says it wants to accomplish, to rise peacefully. And if we don't have Indians and Americans working together, along with other countries like Japan and Australia and so forth, you're going to get a different kind of China than if we do work together. Again, not containment, but shaping the environment in ways that are peaceful. In that sense, both of these issues are going to be with us for some time. The issue of terrorism, of Islamic extremism, how we deal with this, and the issue of shaping the environment as China rises. And I think that means that we're going to be dealing with each other at a serious level on the same side of the table for quite some time to come. But lest I sound, and I'll stop with this, lest I sound too rosy about is everything's all right, there's some things that are not doing so well. If you look at India in global trade relations, India is isolated. It's partly isolated itself. But as the Americans turn toward the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a special transatlantic relationship with Europe, where does India fit? Particularly if India turns its back on real progress in the World Trade Organization. And there are also going to be other issues like climate change, where India has a number of concerns which are different from other countries as we look at the problems of climate change. And there are new issues that are coming along like cybersecurity. Will India side with Russia and China with an authoritarian view of control of the internet? Or will it take the view of what's called multi-stakeholderism for a more open internet? These are major issues that we face and need to confront together. So while at bedrock, I'm absolutely sure that India and the United States are going to be on the same side of the table, it's also true that sometimes even when you're on the same side of the table, you can squabble with your neighbors. And it's in our interest to make sure that we manage those differences so that our larger common interests prevail. And that's been the purpose of this dialogue. And I think if I look back over the 20 years, what's intriguing to me is to see how openly and frankly Indians and Americans have begun to discuss these issues with each other. It's no longer using code words or diplomatic niceties. We've been very frank in the ways in which we discuss this. So overall, Indian-American relations, I'm optimistic. Everything goes visit, that would be rare on any visit anywhere. But I suspect that the absolute climate, the structural aspects of the climate for the Obama visit are that we'll see another successful Obama-Modi visit.
Thank you very much, Joe. Gautam.
I mean, if I see the expanding size of the panel, I'd say the relationship and the dialogue is in rude good health, you know. But I think that taking off from what Joe said a little bit earlier, I think it's very important to also understand that the dialogue and the discussion of some of the comments that Joe talked about is also important from India's point of view, from finding space for our growth as well. I think the growth that we've seen in China happened in a very different environment and in the early years of growth. And I think that the world is a very different place today compared to what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And for India to continue to grow and take its space in the world, I think it's becoming equally important that this dialogue continues at this level. The fact that the dialogue has carried on, the fact that we have now between the government, cooperation across some 38 different sectors is a sign of the effectiveness of the dialogue, is a sign that, to me, the openness with which we can have discussions without getting into positions that allow us then to further work on finding solutions is also, I mean, we are now, what, 20, it's what, 12 years since we started, and the fact that the governments of both countries continue to support this dialogue in its form tells us that we are playing a very, very useful and a very productive role in this. So from our side, from the Indian side, and from the dialogue side, I think that we have come a long way. And it's been very, very good that a large number of participants in the dialogue are very similar to what was there right at the beginning. I don't think we've seen a huge change in the people attending the dialogue, so that's provided for continuity. Certainly the format of discussions have changed, and I think that's important. We moved from the let's get to know each other stage to, all right, we understand each other, we know each other, we can move on to a different way of discussing things and surfacing issues. To me, all of this is great progress. And you're not going to make change in discussion, dialogue, and an understanding in a 2, 3, 4-year time frame. Countries have long memories, and country bureaucracies have even longer memories. So being around 12 years later and being actively involved for, I think, 8 of those 12 years, I would say that this dialogue presents some great opportunities. And there are other issues that are going to crop up as we go forward. Joe talked about the TPP and things like that. Yeah, and I think it's important that India does take a position on this at some point in time. Just one final point before I close. I think we talked about the issue around WTO, but I do believe that in its own way, the fact that this dialogue existed allowed for the United States and India to sit across the table and resolve the agricultural issue bilaterally between themselves. Had this dialogue not existed in any form, I think that would have been a very difficult task for us to bridge. So.
Gautam, thank you. Let's go deeper into the issues, and let me ask my first question to Shyam, and then SK to you. And I would frame it this way. This relationship has changed fundamentally since 2002 and 3. Trade in goods and services has quadrupled, which is a significant achievement. We're working much more closely together on environmental issues, on space exploration, on scientific issues. Our security military cooperation is much more prodigious than it was a decade or 15 years ago. Both of us are victims of extremism, violent extremism, of terrorism. And so homeland security and counterterrorism cooperation is critical to both of us. It's been a growth industry, our cooperation for both governments, and very important to both governments. So that's on the positive side of the ledger. My challenge side of the ledger includes 2 of the issues that Joe and Gautam have mentioned. The fact is that President Obama, one of his major ambitions of the next 2 years, and I think a Republican Congress will work with him on this, are these 2 major trade deals. He needs to get negotiating authority from the Congress, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Treaty. India is not obviously part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership because of the substantial strategic differences between us and I would say between India and most of the Asian economies on global trade matters. That's a serious problem for our relationship. On climate, we saw that President Obama turned to China with the joint statement in Beijing a couple of months ago to be the centerpiece of the global effort to try to bring countries from the Lima meeting to the Paris meeting by the end of 2015 to have a global compact on climate change. India is going to have to play catch up. And one of the questions I'd have to my Indian colleagues is, what is going to be the strategy to make India more relevant globally to those global trade talks as well as the climate talks, in addition to other issues, Shyam and SK? We have sometimes, I think we agree on the major point about Iran, that it shouldn't be a nuclear weapons power. But President Obama and the P5 are approaching the end game in those negotiations at some point in 2015. Will India contribute to pressure Iran, to push Iran to do the right thing and agree to an end result that will leave them well short of a nuclear weapon? It seems to me that India has been silent on that issue over the last year. And on Ukraine, we saw when President Putin visited here, part of the Russian delegation was the so-called governor of Crimea, which is an illegitimate entity, and he was received here with meetings in Delhi. And so you have to wonder whether on those important issues the US and India are operating at cross purposes. When the Prime Minister came to Washington and New York, he said a lot about India's economic revival. He said very little in public about his view of the United States. Does he believe that the United States is a strategic partner? And so Shyam and SK, what do you think about both sides of this ledger? And what should the Prime Minister be doing to prepare for the President's visit?
I think it was always apparent that India and the United States will have issues on which they will not be aligned. And I think that should be accepted. Not necessarily what the list of items that you have mentioned. I think you should take heart from the fact that despite a rather bitter legacy, this Prime Minister has reached out to the United States, not let that come in the way of actually reaching out to the US in the visit that he made to the United States, and much more that he has now extended an invitation to President Obama to be the chief guest at India's Republic Day. I think if you see these two initiatives taken by the new Prime Minister, there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that he looks upon the relationship with the United States as an extremely important element in his overall foreign policy. That whatever vision he has of India and its future, he would like to see the United States of America as a very important partner of India. So I think before we start looking into squabbling about this issue or that issue, I think you should focus attention on that, because you are missing the story if you are not looking at what these initiatives taken by this new Prime Minister mean. Despite, as I said, a rather bitter legacy in his own personal case of the past. So that is one very important aspect. Secondly, I think with regard to some of the specific issues that you mentioned, it should come as no surprise to you that we have a somewhat different take on these matters. As far as climate change is concerned, you mentioned that there is a very important initiative which has been taken by the US and China, and both US and China are quite welcome to that initiative. But if we look at that particular initiative, it has a certain political importance for both the US as well as China. But that deal certainly does nothing for meeting the challenge of climate change. If you are going to have China, which is going to continue increasing its emissions till 2030, and the US is going to reduce, that's very welcome, you are going to end up with a per capita emission of something like 12 tons per capita. If the two largest emitters in the world are going to end up at that level, frankly speaking, we don't see this as a very major initiative for dealing with climate change. But as I said, the issue of this being a global issue on which China and the United States have been able to come to some understanding, it's welcome in itself. I think that's is an important initiative. As far as India is concerned, I don't think India has to catch up. I think others have to catch up with India. I think India is, in terms of its climate policy, has done far more than many other developing countries have. Whether it is in terms of its renewable energy targets, whether it is in terms of increasing its energy efficiency. And by the way, the United States of America has played a very important role in helping India move towards clean energy. We have actually a very ambitious clean energy collaboration program. The United States of America has helped India with its energy conservation policy. The energy conservation building code which India has is actually something which the United States of America helped us with. And there are a number of other areas in renewable energy where actually there is very good cooperation between India and the United States. Why not focus attention on that? This Prime Minister has said that he wants to increase the target for solar energy to 100 gigawatts. Well, that's a huge opportunity for the United States. Why don't you work together with us to actually advance that, rather than say, China and the US have done this and therefore you need to catch up. I don't think that is really the way to approach this. Second, with regard to the issue of global trade, I think the United States of America needs to understand what India's current compulsions are, as it was pointed out by Gautam, that the environment in which India is seeking to grow at 6 to 7% per annum or 8% per annum is very different from the environment in which China grew. And yet, I would say, the kind of new energy which you see in India, the kind of prospects for investment that are opening up in India, there is, again, an opportunity that the United States of America and American firms should try to take advantage of. Because this is going to be a big expanding market, and there are a number of new areas where actually the United States of America has much to offer to India in terms of technology, in terms of better ways of doing business. there is that opportunity that I hope during the visit we will be focusing attention on. What are the opportunities rather than keep looking at what the obstacles are? I think we are overcoming those obstacles. Thirdly, as far as the issues of Iran and Ukraine are concerned, very briefly, I don't think that India has been silent about the Iranian nuclear program. I don't think you have been listening. We have all the time taken the view that a nuclear weapon Iran is not something that India would welcome. But we have also said that this is an issue which needs to be resolved through dialogue, not through confrontation. And we have welcomed and applauded President Obama's initiative to actually try and use diplomacy to come to some kind of conclusion on this. And we have applauded every time some progress has been made in that. So actually, India has been very supportive of the United States, so I don't know why this is being projected as something on which there is a contention. Finally, on Ukraine. Indian perspective is that there was really no reason for there to be this kind of a confrontation, partly provoked by the actions of the United States and West European countries. If you look at it from India's point of view, who has gained from this? It is the Chinese who are laughing their way over to the bank. It makes no sense when you are looking at a long-term challenge for the rise of China to actually end up with a situation where Russia is being pushed towards China. And this has had a fallout on India. Because as far as the defense relationship between Russia and India is concerned, it has become somewhat more complex because of the Chinese factor. Also, the energy partnership between China and Russia, which the Russians were a little wary of in the past. Now you have a 30-year, gas agreement. Now, the United States of America sometimes feels that, Russia is a declining power. It is not going to really get its act together. I think our assessment is somewhat different. You are dealing with a very major power which has huge potential, which has huge amount of resources, and it's a nuclear weapon state. So I think one should be careful not to think of Russia as somehow or the other not any more a power which should be reckoned with. India would have preferred that we were not put in a position where we have to sort of make choices in terms of our relationship with Russia and our relationship with the US. Having said that, I think the most important thing is that the way in which the global situation is evolving, on the defense side, you mentioned that the defense relationship is one of the bright spots in India-US relations. I see that in the emerging global landscape, the India-US defense relationship, defense hardware relationship is probably going to see much more energy than it has in the past. And I would imagine that during the forthcoming visit, this will be an area of major increase in our collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And SK, let me just ask you the same question. What are India's strategic interests with the United States? And let me add an issue where you are expert, and that's Afghanistan. It seems to me that India and the United States have similar interests in preventing a resurgence of the Taliban, supporting the Afghan government of Ashraf Ghani. The United States is projected to withdraw all of its troops by the end of 2016. If you could speak to that as well, we'd be grateful.
Well, thank you. I wouldn't like to repeat what Shyam has already mentioned. Joe mentioned that he was there in Udaipur. I was not there in Udaipur, but I joined this dialogue about a year later and have been through the process of momentum, process of achievement, doubts and drifts that have been in our relations. Joe mentioned that there were some disagreements. I'm glad there were disagreements because if two people agree, then one becomes unnecessary. But those disagreements really strengthened our discussions, strengthened our dialogue, and strengthened our convictions. I don't think so. One can make preconditions on how relations of one country should be dependent on the other. You know, you mentioned Iran, you mentioned Russia. 4 years ago, but you did not mention Myanmar. Because 4 years ago, we were being told that this is the way we should look at Myanmar. Now, because your relations with Myanmar have improved, you have decided to cut that out. But let me tell you that we told you at that time, and we are telling you today, that Myanmar is our neighbor and is very important for us. Shyam is a former ambassador there and will be able to tell you more about it. Similarly, Iran is very close to us, and you have to understand our relations with Iran, not only in respect of our overall relations, but also in respect of India's relations with with West Asia and the region. Russia has been an old friend of ours, but we judge all our friends by their actions, and I think that, as Shyam had mentioned, what worries us is that some of the actions being taken these days are bringing Russia closer to China. You know, this was not the case when I was ambassador in Russia 10, 12 years ago. But again, India has very close relations with Russia, and they will continue. So, but that doesn't mean that that will affect our relations with the United States, to which I come. Our relations with the United States have progressed considerably, as I mentioned, in the last 15 years. And let us look at some specifics. You know, and even if the civil nuclear deal, yes, there are problems, but I think that both in respect of liability on our side and administrative arrangements on yours, some progress is being made. The resurgence in the US economy and the environment here should give a momentum to our economic relations. On defense, I think we have made considerable progress. When we started this dialogue, our purchases were ZERO 0, and today they are over 10 billion. And I think what is being discussed currently, the lists being exchanged, are of a far more, I'm not talking in terms of dollars and rupees, but in terms of bringing our two countries together, they can play a significant role. Climate change has been adequately touched, but connected with that is the very important aspect of clean energy. You are an expert on Indo-US relations and have been a part of high-level meetings. Since 2000, I think the number of initiatives on clean energy that have been discussed at our high-level meetings are more than in any other area. And that is where I think we should build on these successes, and why not consider a finance-driven approach on clean energy, which is to meet the rural needs based either on micro or off renewable energy-based system, which would be, because clean energy is of vital interest to us. You know, 12% of our energy is non-conventional, 17 is hydro, and 2 is nuclear. So that's an area on which we can work together greatly in the coming days, and I think some of the discussions that you have in the next few days and on the eve of the President's visit, this is an area where we could work together. Well, of course, cybersecurity and counterterrorism, as I was just speaking to your former ambassador, who is not on the panel, but is sitting in front. It was signed during his time. That's an agreement which is, can bring us together, and that's a subject that brings us to Afghanistan, since you asked me. You know, we feel just as you told us, tell us about different, that in South Asia, we should be able to, I don't like the word align, but connect our policies in such a way that you must understand that that's an area where we have great interest. And we should be able to discuss issues in that aspect, not only South Asia, but also in the wider Indian Ocean region. Afghanistan, last point. You are leaving and we are going to stay. You know, the point is that we are a neighbor of Afghanistan. And some of the problems which we see there don't seem to be resolved. The progress is fragile, and terrorism continues to emanate from there. There are distinctions being made about the good and the bad, but as the developments in Paris, you know, we are meeting 2 days after Paris. In Washington, we had met 2-3 days after 26/11, I remember one of our dialogue. And that had enabled us to discuss these aspects seriously. So in Afghanistan, we find that till adequate measures are taken to ensure that the present Afghan armed forces can continue to be financed and function cohesively, there could be problems. So those would have to be discussed. And the source of terror, whether in Afghanistan or around Afghanistan, is still not under control. Until that is brought under control, there could be trouble for neighbors, including us. I think I would come more on this subject as we proceed in the discussion.
Thank you very much. And before I ask Frank and Jim to weigh in, I have a question for both of them. Just a very quick follow-up question, SK, for you and one for Sean. SK, could you just continue, because we're on this subject of Afghanistan. Would it be a mistake, in your judgment, and you have vast experience in South Asia, for the United States to withdraw all of its troops by the end of 2016? That's going to be a debate in our country. It's going to come up in our dialogue this weekend. I would imagine to be part of Prime Minister Modi's discussions with President Obama. That's a question for you. And a quick follow-up for Sham. We negotiated the Civil Nuclear Agreement and finished it by 2008. It has never been implemented. Is the Modi government, in your judgment, dedicated to trying to find a way this agreement? I think just an answer from both of you would help us on both these issues.
I think it's a decision which you have to take. And there are divided views here, but my personal view is that once you decided to come, the purpose for which you came, till that is accomplished, you must stay on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sean?
My sense is that when the Prime Minister visited Washington, and in their discussions which were held with President Obama, a decision was arrived at that some kind of a working group would be set up where also the stakeholder companies would be involved, that is including the Nuclear Power Corporation on the Indian side, and try to see whether some kind of arrangements could be worked out that would satisfy some of the concerns which the corporate sector in the United States have raised. The issue really here is that I think the US needs to understand that politically it would be very difficult to concede what the US wants, that is a change in the law itself. But short of actually amending the law, what are the ways in which we can find solutions to this dilemma that both of us face? That is, I think, what our approach should be. I think you would recall, Nick, that during the negotiations on the nuclear deal itself, there were a number of occasions where we actually came to like a stone wall.
I remember.
Where we could not find a way out.
Yeah.
How did we find a way out? We tried to find a way around it because both sides were very focused on making this happen. I think that particular approach has been somewhat missing in dealing with the liability issue. I think if we go to this issue with the same kind of spirit, I have really no doubt that we would be able to find a way.
So you think amending the nuclear liability law is not going to be possible in the Indian parliament?
Well, I do not, I mean, I'm not a politician, so I cannot make a definitive statement, but I would say that it would be difficult, even for this government with the majority that it has, to move in the foreseeable future to actually bringing about an amendment to the law.
Thank you. Frank and Jim, so I would ask you a question, really the opposite question that I asked of SK and Shyam, and that is, as President Obama prepares to arrive in India, he'll be the first American president ever to make 2 visits in his tenure in office to India, and he should be very proud of that. What are the opportunities for him? And what are some of the issues that he's going to have to be careful about? We've talked, I mean, both Joe and I in opening comments talked about what's positive in the relationship and what are the challenges. And you have to face both in diplomacy. You can't sweep the challenges under the rug. How do you see his agenda here in Delhi? Please, Ambassador.
It's an incredible moment, and I join everyone on the panel in feeling we're in front of a time of a great opportunity for both the United States and India. And it's therefore an imperative that this visit be the success that I think it can be. Nick, you made a very accurate, or you put before me a very accurate and sharp question. The President, as he comes to India on this trip, has an opportunity to continue the view that I am certain he has and project that view to an Indian audience, that the United States profits from and wants India's rise to great power status. India's strength, India's economic success are good for the United States. That core assertion on the President's part, in my mind, is essential that that message be maintained before the Indian public. The second, flowing from that, is a signal that we and India share common security perspectives. Those perspectives we touched on to some degree today. They are at core 3 and 2 on the American side. The 3 major issues that we have to face together in power terms is the relationship with China, the relationship with Pakistan, the relationship with Afghanistan, and then, of course, questions related to the war on terror and cyber security. On all of those issues, I hope that the President will be very clear in signaling to the Indian public and to the press and to parliamentary opinion that we in India will find a way to communicate with each other so that there will be no surprises in our relationship, that we will be able to communicate with one another without dragging every matter out into the public press, and we will find ways to either accommodate each other's points of view or find ways to offset that accommodation by strengthening our ties in other areas. It is particularly important that the President leave the impression that he and Prime Minister Modi and his respective governments will continue to communicate in depth on those issues, that there will be, in a word, no surprises. But if it's important to have, on the one hand, a sense that the United States will listen to India and will also expect India to listen to our concerns in the Middle East, in Ukraine, it's important at the other side to have for the President to project the second great issue in the Indian-American relationship, and that's the economic question. And here I hope to resolve the ordinary disagreements, and of which there are many, that make it difficult for the United States to be a full partner and investor in the Indian economy. But I would hope as well that the President will pick up a line from his remarks in Brisbane, in which he welcomed India's entry into the Asia-Pacific trading arena and put the United States into association with India in that regard, that he will signal the United States is prepared to be India's partner as India moves into a fuller free trade posture, one that will help the Prime Minister achieve the goal of 16 million jobs, that will make India a more competitive society. So if the President can signal that partnership, not laying challenges only to India, but laying challenges to ourselves, he will give a sense of vision of where we could go in the future.
Thank you, Frank, very much. And finally, Jim Steinberg. Jim has a unique advantage in this panel. He was part of President Clinton's team that made the first big opening to India in the second term of President Clinton's presidency, and he was Deputy Secretary of State when the Obama administration advanced a very successful state visit here in the autumn of 2010.
So it's hard to improve on Ambassador Wisner's comprehensive and very thoughtful assessment of where we are, but I think the discussion we've had up till now really illustrates the conundrum in the relationship, which is, on the one hand, we've all been concerned over the last decade or so about the danger of the relationship becoming transactional, too focused on individual issues, less focused on the broader context. At the same time, the credibility of the broader context depends on making progress on specific issues. And so we need some of both. And getting the balance right, I think, is the real challenge, which is that it's important to have this broader vision. And I think Sham is right in saying it's very important for Americans to appreciate the significance of this invitation of the Prime Minister to be part of the Republic. That in itself is quite important. But it's also true that we can't just live on that. And so we have to find a way, on the one hand, not to get dragged down the transactions. And I think that's been the problem from President Clinton's visit, which was very symbolic. And the time that he spent here, the number of days that he spent, his travels around the country, his speech to the Parliament, all of these things were about that sort of broader context. And yet the disappointments and the frustrations have been because of the lack of progress on these other issues. And so we have to find a way, on the one hand, not to have every visit judged by the specific deliverables, which is what the press always wants, but also to recognize that without deliverables and without progress on the kinds of issues that you and Joe and others have identified. And for that reason, I worry a little bit about this focus on the term strategic partnership and the identification, because in some ways I think it's creating some false or unachievable expectations about what we can do. I mean, Sham's accounts on some of these issues where we do really have differences are things that we should be okay with. I mean, we are going to have differences. There isn't a full convergence of perspective on these things. I have to say, on Ukraine, it continues to surprise me. If India had one of its neighbors sending special forces into one of its provinces to support separatists, you would not feel good about it. And I would think that you'd have some resonance to why we are concerned about what Russia did there. But what does it mean to have a strategic partnership where on issues that are important to both of us, we really do have different views? And I think that's why, to steal a phrase from this other big relationship that we have with China, we do need to have a new kind of major power relationship here with India, one in which, as Frank says, that we fully and enthusiastically support the idea of India being a major player in the globe, unequivocally. I mean, I think one of the things that I feel best about the early days of the Obama administration was the decision to unequivocally support the idea of India's membership on the Security Council. There should be no question about that. I mean, for me, it's not even a matter of debate. And it doesn't matter whether India will always support the Security Council. It absolutely will not, right? And that's what it means to have confidence in the relationship, to say that the world will be a better place if India is playing this role, even if we have disagreements on important issues, and that's okay, because the broader contributions that India can make, and that, to my mind, is at the core of what we need to do, to make progress when we can on the specific issues, but to understand that the long-term interests, as Joe said in his opening remarks, will work out enough that the world will be a better place when we work together in that way.
Thank you very much.
One quick-
Sure. Yeah.
Just one quick way to understand this when we think about the differences in security and economics and so forth. View, a growing and stronger India is an American interest. That is fundamental to the relationship.
And so we're going to go to questions from all of you, and just if you raise your hand, we'll try to recognize as many questions as we can. As we ask these questions, a challenge to the panel. Jim has given us a challenge. What should this relationship be called? President Bush and Prime Minister Singh said it was a special relationship, a strategic partnership. You have a special strategic partnership with Russia. You've added a word. And so Jim has given us a challenge that we should think about, but Joe's right. President Bush said the rise of India as a global power, George W. Bush, is in the strategic interest of the United States. President Obama said the same thing when he came here. So Americans don't disagree on that. Yes, sir.
Sir, being former ambassador, I'm also founding president of Indo-American Friends Association. Just exactly a month back on December 8th, I organized a similar panel discussion at Chicago University Center in Delhi. I had 7 panelists: Dr. Sachit Tharoor, Ambassador Lalit Mansi, Gurcharan Das, H.K. Dua, Gurcharan Das, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, and your DCM. Now, at the end, we asked, the topic was Obama-Modi summit in Washington. Does it signify a paradigm shift in India-US relations? At the end, the panel felt that while it created a lot of buzz, hope, expectation, soundbite, and all the headlines, in concrete terms, it did not qualify to be called a paradigm shift. I would like to know, since 30th September 2014 till 26 January 2015, what has happened in concrete terms which will justify to qualify this forthcoming visit as a leap forward in bilateral relations? Thank you.
And I think that's the question that the panelists have been trying to ask, but maybe, I don't think we need to answer it. We don't need to have everybody respond, but is anyone particularly interested? Sean, why don't you take this on?
Well, it's only 4 months. As I pointed out, that the fact that 4 months later, President Obama is coming as chief guest for our Republic Day in itself is a very important step forward, because it is signaling not only to the Americans but to Indians that this is a relationship which has a certain value to both countries. The point that was made about the U.S. unequivocal assertion that it is in U.S. interest that India emerges as a strong power. I would say that on the Indian side, there is an equal interest in a United States which continues to be a major power as well. That the role of the United States as still the knowledge capital of the world, as still a country which is the only country which still has a global reach. This is something that also we consider to be in India's interest. So there is that parallel kind of a interest that the two countries have. And I think rather than look at very specific things, and I have no doubt that there will be specific things. I do not believe that there will be no transactional elements at all in this visit. But I think while we are looking at those transactional elements, I think attention focused on, I still believe it is a strategic partnership. I would not dilute that relationship. I think there is a strategic partnership for the simple reason that there are certain long-term interests that the two countries have. The rise of China, for example, what Joe mentioned, or the growing challenge of terrorism, international terrorism. These are issues on which India and the United States have long-term convergence, and therefore I believe we have a strategic partnership. So I think it is not an inappropriate term.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, sir, right back here.
Madhurendra Jha, I'm a trade lawyer in Delhi. My question for the American members of the panel is, for the United States to be by far the largest investor in Make in India and the largest buyer from India, and thereby to have a lot of influence in India as well. Is it possible, do you think there would be any way after the 2008 crisis for any circumstance in which the United States legislature and administration could be convinced to revert to the pre-2008 type of economic diplomacy that the United States engaged in, rather than in the post-2008 diplomacy, at least in respect of India? And the post-2008 diplomacy is being perceived, including by many in the United States, as being transactional and protectionist. Whereas from World War II till 2008, the United States was extraordinarily and unprecedented and without any precedent generous to its friends and allies, and tolerated even the export of completely viable and competitive US jobs to its leading friends and allies, while by contrast, China is often seen as a net importer of jobs.
Thank you very much. Jim? You know, I'll leave it to others to say whether there was a change in diplomacy in that respect. I think, first of all, there's a broad enthusiasm for the Make in India initiatives that the Prime Minister has initiated. But at the end of the day, this isn't mostly about governments. The question is, what are the things that India needs to do to get, at least in the case of the United States, where we don't have a public sector to invest in India, what will it be necessary to convince American firms to invest and build opportunity here? I mean, he's been very clear about this, and his statements are very clear that he wants people to come, he wants people to help create jobs and opportunity. So I think the challenge is the kinds of things that the Prime Minister himself has laid out, the agenda that he's laid out, and it's not a function of American diplomacy. It's really carrying through on the things that he and his government and the administration has recognized are necessary to make, whether it's rule of law, corruption, making the India no longer number 142 on the World Bank's list of most difficult places to do business. And I don't think that's a question of American diplomacy. I think it's a question of really meeting the aspirations and the expectations that the Prime Minister himself has laid out. And thank you for your question. I think I'm going to take up Jim's challenge. I served in the George W. Bush administration. I have not served in the Obama administration. I don't believe that President Obama has somehow not pursued an assertive, positive policy of engagement with India. I think he has. I think what's remarkable about our country right now is that Republicans and Democrats agree on very little. But there is a bipartisan consensus that India is a priority, that India should be a strategic partner. And I see President Obama and President Bush as very close in the way they look at India and the way they've acted towards India. And there's no better expert on that than Tim Romer, Ambassador Romer, so I'll call on you to take up that fight as well.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, first of all, that from what the panel has said, I think we should rename what is on this board behind you, President Obama, another visit to India, implementing the strategic relationship, ! I would say, back to what Ambassador Lamba said a little bit earlier, you know that this has been elevated to a very respectful strategic relationship when we have had President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, and their counterparts in the Congress and the BJP parties all work together to make this a respected relationship of a risen superpower democracy and a risen, developed democracy that is only about 67 years old, who we want to succeed and be strategically powerful in the world. When we signed, as SK mentioned, this very historic landmark counterterrorism and intelligence sharing agreement in 2010, when I was here, we started to share some of the most important and sensitive intelligence in the world with the government of India to try to prevent another Mumbai attack, to try to prevent a war possibly between Pakistan and India, to try to bolster India's abilities on counterterrorism against Lashkar-e-Taiba and other groups, to try to help both these democracies fight terrorism around the world. And if that's not a strategic relationship, while we don't agree on every single issue, as Shaim said, this is certainly elevating the relationship all the time. The second point I would make is, and I think this is one for us to think about, how do we implement other parts of the strategic relationship that are crucial for our people? The poor in India, the middle class in India, the voters in India, so that India continues to be a strong place for the people to succeed. And we're talking about climate change and clean air. I was just in China, in Chengdu, and you didn't even see the blue sky for 4 days. And one of the ministers in China said to us, "Our skies are on fire. You must help us. Help us." So what more can the United States and India do together on natural gas, on alternatives, hydro, and solar? And our first African-American president, somebody who's articulated from the democratic system hope and change and trying to make progress in these areas, somebody that came from very humble background, and Mr. Modi, a tea stall seller coming from humble background. They're both struggling with making their respective democratic systems work and get things done for the people and help the middle class get jobs. So I would say to the panel, how on the US side and how on the Indian side do we get Mr. Modi and Mr. Obama after this meeting in January to actually implement and work on successfully through their governments the agreements that they're going to reach, both that they agreed to in September and will agree to in January, whether it's a bit, whether it's finally getting the civil nuclear agreement agreed to and passed, whether it's new health care and education initiatives or water or clean air. How do we get our governments to work more effectively, because we are so proud of the values and the diversity and the openness and the right that we can stand up and we can critique our respective governments. You can't do that in many places around the world. You sure can here, and you sure can in America. And it's one of the great things about both our systems and why I was so proud to serve in this great country, serve my president, my people for that. So how do we get these systems to work better?
Ambassador, thank you. That's a good question. Maybe I'll ask one of our American panelists and one of our Indian panelists to take up that challenge. It's not enough just to have a successful summit meeting. You've got to actually operationalize it and implement it. Frank, you've had a lot of experience as a diplomat. What's your suggestion?
Well, I'm going to go back and pick up a remark that Jim Steinberg made. Much of the contribution that the United States will be able to make to this country will be our ability to mobilize our private sector to support Indian growth. And that, in turn, is dependent on the actions taken to create an investment environment in India that will make it possible for American companies to come here and feel that they are taxed fairly, that their intellectual property rights are protected, that the administrative procedures that they deal with are handled in an expeditious manner. If that happens, then I believe the job of the United States government in delivering an economic response, unlike the period after World War II where the public sector provided extraordinary flows of foreign assistance, the flows of American capital and technology to India will increase. So we're looking for an India that enables an environment, and the United States that encourages that and sits down with India and resolves the disputes or the issues that surround the flow of goods and services from our economy to India. How do we make the Indian system work more efficiently? I'm really impressed with what I see as the Prime Minister's opening moves. The moves to drive conclusions from his administration, to set goals, to get Parliament to pass laws where laws can't be passed immediately, to switch to ordinances. I see a pattern of delivery that I find very, very exciting. On the American side, I also see a commitment to bring American attention, to create an environment in which American companies can operate here, and that's going to provide the framework for which private sector flows can occur.
Thank you, Frank. Gautam or SK, do you have a sense on the Indian side, implementation? This is a very powerful prime minister who's centralized a lot of power in his office. Is that where the implementation will come from?
Well, I think Frank touched on it very, very, inappropriately. Corruption is also a form of the ease of doing business. The more transparent and the easier it is to do business, the less corruption you have. And I think the way he has come in and said, look, we need to get, as a businessman, I can tell you that the last 5 years prior to this administration, we have seen more backdoor creeping legislation and rules come into doing business in this country than the previous 15 years. In fact, a lot of stuff that had happened in the 90s has been rolled back, but not through legislative procedure, but through regulatory and other ways of doing it. So in a sense, what you saw has been actually negative, even for Indian business. This is just not about, foreign capital will supplement domestic savings in our growth cycle. But foreign capital is not going to take the lead in getting this economy back where it has to go. That has to ease up for Indian business as well, to start making investments back and out here. And I think the focus to just clean out some of this stuff that's been hanging around here for donkeys of years is a very, very positive thing. Secondly, you take his experience in Gujarat now. There are some parallels and there are not. In Gujarat, you're a chief minister, you're pretty much the king of the state and you do what you want to do. But when you look at this government, I think one of the things that you have to give a little time for is the fact that you have a lot of ministerial people who have never held a ministerial job before. Some have never had an administrative job before. To ask somebody to come into a ministry and comprehensively understand an administrative and a legislative agenda from a policy point of view in 4 months, I'm sorry, but I would think you'd have to be Superman to do that. So, and despite that, I think you've seen very practical, very pragmatic decisions being taken by this government. If we can't get it through the legislative procedure, put the ordinance in place. We will tackle that issue when we come to it, and things like that. So purely just from an Indian business sitting out here, it's going to take time, we understand, to unravel some of the damage that's been done in the previous years. But is that going to mean that nothing is going to happen? No. I think you're going to see the country start reviving pretty soon. Maybe a couple of quarters away before you actually see that momentum going. But yes, the ease of doing business is vitally important for Indian business as much as it is for foreign businesses or for American businesses. And anecdotally, I can say there's a huge amount of interest again from the US and from US corporations in investing back in India. Yeah.
Thank you. SK, anything, Doctor?
Well, I think in addition to what has been said, the resurgence in the US economy and the fall in oil prices is also going to have an impact, a positive impact on our.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, yes.
Thank you, Nick. I'm Anup Bose. I'm a senior advocate, Supreme Court, and advisor to the House of Tata, and an indefatigable friend of the United States. The horrifying spin-chilling drift of events in France has once again opened the eyes of the international community to the scourge of global terrorism fueled by radical Islamism. Two dreaded terrorist kingpins live in Pakistan, Dawood Ibrahim and Hafiz Saeed. And the United States is not only aware of their presence, the evil presence, but is also aware of the threat they pose to the United States and its citizens. Now, the first question is, what and how do you propose to deal with this Dawood, Syed axis of evil as two great democratic nations? That's the first question. And the second question is shorter, and that's on the aspect that I've been discussing with Nick for a long time, not just cyber security, but cyber warfare. How do these two countries, as great friends, propose to work in fencing our two great nations from any cyber attack? Thank you.
Thank you. Are you addressing those of the American contingent or the Indian? I just want to be sure.
All your views.
All right. Well, I know that Josa has been studying the cyber issue. Maybe we'll take that second question first. I'll ask Joe to speak about cyber. And then I'd be interested in Ambassador Lumba's view on your first question, as well as maybe Jim or Frank answering that one.
Well, the cyber issue is becoming more important, and at the end of this year, there's a large conference at the United Nations on the world, basically 10th anniversary of the World Conference on Information Society. And one of the interesting questions is that Russia and China, two authoritarian countries, have taken a position which is that free speech, as we would call it, is a security threat and should be outlawed. So, for example, if there's a message that the government regards as threatening to the regime, that becomes a security threat and should be illegal. The United States says, no, that is not the way to approach it. We should have what's called a multi-stakeholder broad approach to cyber governance. And what's interesting to me is that India, who, with its democratic traditions, who I would have expected to side with the Western countries, has actually voted with China and Russia. It's a bit of a puzzle. So at the Net Mundial conference in Brazil last spring, Brazil came down with other democratic countries. India didn't. I asked my Indian friends, how is this? And they say it's because of entrenched bureaucrats who still think that India is part of the non-aligned movement, and that's more important than freedom and protection of the internet. I don't know whether that's the answer or not, but I do know how India came down on the votes. So I think it's time for India and the US to start having some quiet discussions together, saying we're on the same side of this. How are we going to find ways to protect the internet and not fall into the trap of believing that an authoritarian solution is the answer?
This is a vital issue. We'll certainly talk about it this weekend. Anybody else in the panel want to talk about cyber before we go to Pakistan? Ambassador, the Pakistan question.
Well, I think there is nothing has been done by India in practical terms which has in any way gone contrary to what your views on internet are. You know, we are a democracy, but you do need to protect. And I think the quiet discussions, as you said, there has been, I think, similarity of views on the subject. And maybe we should let it develop. On the earlier question on terrorism, I think this is something that we face here, and terrorism emanating from around us. And there, I think that we need a greater understanding, because we at times get a feeling that a distinction is being made between a good and a bad terrorist. As what happened in France yesterday, 2 days ago shows, there is no distinction. The man was there, they knew it, was released, and he's again done it. So we find that in the specific cases that was mentioned by the senior advocate of the Supreme Court, who has a legal knowledge which I don't have, but are issues which we need greater support and public support for that matter also.
Maybe for the U.S. side, Jim and I can answer the question, because I can speak on what the Bush administration's experience was, and Jim can speak about the Obama administration's. I would just say I thought one of the most important policy changes that President Bush and especially Secretary of State Condi Rice made was to say that we should have independent relationships with India and Pakistan. We should not twin that relationship and try to balance what we do with one and the other. And that led us to the civil nuclear agreement with India, and very definitely not with Pakistan, for obvious reasons, given the AQ-Khan network. Similarly, on counterterrorism, I think the greatest growth that we made in the second term of President Bush was to have a much larger and more intensive relationship with India to try to defend both countries from terrorists. We did not have that kind of relationship with Pakistan. Our frustration with Pakistan was that homegrown terrorists there, or al-Qaeda there, were striking at our troops in Afghanistan. And you've had the same frustration about Lashkar-e-Taiba. So I see a coincidence of views here. Joe said at the beginning that, in essence, he thinks it's almost inevitable we're going to have a strong strategic relationship. He's right, not just because of security in Asia vis-a-vis China, but also because of this terrorist group. We are both victims, sometimes of the same groups. Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo Nick's points. I mean, I can assure you that there's nobody in the U.S. who thinks there's a such thing as a good terrorist. And I think it's well known that perhaps the most contentious feature of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is our dissatisfaction with the way that Pakistan has dealt with it. And frankly, as Americans and Indians have always said to Pakistani, Pakistan's reaping the whirlwind of its own policies. This horrible massacre of the students in Pakistan is just an example of the consequences of not taking all the steps that are necessary to deal with it. You know, it is true we have not absolutely ruptured and ended diplomatic relations with Pakistan, notwithstanding our dissatisfaction with some of the things that we've done. But we've also have not been tolerant of or quiet about the need for Pakistan to be unequivocal about addressing these concerns because, as you said, I mean, there is simply, there has to be an unequivocal, no-tolerance, universal commitment to deal with this problem. It is such a deep scourge, and unless we're all together in this, we're not going to be successful.
Gautam?
I think just, sorry to make a little point, I think what happened in Paris is the worst nightmare of most governments, not because of the incident, but these are French citizens who have attacked the French state. I think in the US, that's a huge issue, and I think here in India, I think with our Muslim population, I think this is a big issue. And looking at the size of our Muslim population out here and looking at the youth in that sector, I think some of the things that we need to do as a country and as a government in terms of growth, in terms of inclusion, in terms of employment, we have to think seriously about this issue because I don't think you should worry as much in the long term about what's coming from Pakistan as much as you need to start worrying about, you know, are you doing enough at home to make sure that you don't have a problem like coming up out here.
Can I just add one word? This horror in France, like the horror in Mumbai, has often led people to say we're now facing what Samuel Huntington predicted, a clash of civilizations between Islam and the rest. If we fall into that trap of thinking, we justify the other side. What we're seeing is not a clash of civilizations. We're seeing a civil war within one civilization. And the worst thing we can do is to anathematize Islam. And here's where India can play an enormously important role, because the extent to which India manages to integrate Muslims and Hindus together, it is contributing to the right answer to this. The extent to which in the United States we've had a somewhat better record at integrating Muslim immigrants than some of our European colleagues, that's also important. But the biggest danger we all face as we deal with this is to forget that this is a battle inside Islam, and if we anathematize Islam as a whole, we all lose.
Right. Exactly right. Here's what we're going to do. We have time for one more question. We have to end by 6:30 because I want to give each of the panelists a minute or so to say whatever they wish to say to conclude this conversation. So I'll go right to you, right here.
Straub Talbot's account of his negotiations with Jaswant Singh mentions that in one of the conversations, Jaswant Singh referred to the clash of civilization and suggested that this emerging clash of civilization, US and India must be allies to confront the civilizations it could come in conflict with. Now that India has a BJP government, do you think it is anyway going to be qualitatively different from the way the Congress government had been pursuing its relations with the United States?
That sounds like a question for our Indian participants. Shyam.
No, I do not see how this is an issue of India-US relations. I think fundamentally, as was pointed out by Gautam, I think a great deal depends upon how we manage the great diversity that this country has. And despite the fact that we have had some setbacks during the last so many years, by and large, I think India is a good example of a plural democracy which has been successful in managing diversity. In fact, in a sense, celebrating diversity. I think that is the path on which we should go, because that's the path which has been proven to be successful. And in terms of what we are seeing today as a kind of a polarization, which is leading to the sort of, crises that we are seeing in different parts of the world, the Shia-Sunni divide, the divide, that is sectarian divide, which you see, for example, in the Middle East. These are precisely the sort of things that, if you look at India, it has actually managed quite well, because actually Shia population in India is the second largest after Iran. So in terms of being able to, through the very inclusive democracy that you have, through the plural democracy that you have, if you are able to manage this, this is something which I believe the United States, which is also today a very diverse country, also a plural democracy, this is something that the US would celebrate, because I think eventually it is how plural democracies come together that will determine whether or not these kind of, the more fundamentalist elements or extremist elements can be contained. Because only if plural democracies succeed and if plural democracies work together. I think that is one of the very important strategic missions, in a sense, that India and the United States have.
Right. SK?
Well, I have nothing to add on this particular issue, except that to remind him that the discussions which Strobe Talbot had was during the BJP government. So there is we are going...
And Strobe wrote an awfully good book about those discussions, by the way. So we're going to conclude. I'm going to ask each, starting with Ambassador Wisner, each of the panelists, maybe just to say, I'll lead you, are you bullish or bearish about this relationship? And as the Prime Minister and President get set to meet, what's their biggest opportunity, what's their biggest challenge? In 1 minute, of course.
Great. Nick, thank you. As I listened to the conversation this evening, my mind went back 20 years ago to a moment I had in the White House with President Clinton and Prime Minister Rao. And we sat over lunch, and the lunch came down to a discussion of US almond exports to India. That conversation is unimaginable today. But I cite the anecdote simply to remind ourselves, as exciting as the prospect of President Obama's visit is on Republic Day, this is about a relationship that has grown incrementally in the most extraordinary manner over, in historic terms, a relatively brief period. That we can't measure it in what happens in 4 months, but we're talking about attitude changes that profoundly affect the way both sides look at the other, and the way we think about our economics, the way we think about our security. I look at the President's trip, therefore, as a way of focusing on where we should go next, how to keep the momentum going in the relationship. And therefore, I come back to a core point that Joe opened the discussion today. I think we need to keep new goals before our minds, as well as deal with the issues that have brought us this far. And I truly believe that focusing Indian-American cooperation in an expanded world of free trade is a terrific objective for both of us to share.
Thank you. SK?
The way, taking over from what Frank said, the way relationship has developed in the last 20 years is that you will find that none of the Indian participants, if I recall, have uttered the word Pakistan, because there is so much between India and US. But talking of Indo-US relations, I would say that we should be realistic in our expectations, and so that we do not have disappointment. But I think sky is the limit.
Thank you. Joe?
Well, to use an analogy, there is a marriage between Indian and American interests, and we're fated to live together. I don't see any divorce in the future, but that doesn't mean we aren't going to often quarrel about who does what chores. But the quarrels will be alleviated by something we haven't mentioned so far, which is the Indian diaspora, number of Indians in the United States. It's quite extraordinary. You know, what is it? 2 of our 50 states are ruled by Indians. We have an extraordinary political importance of Indians in the American body politic. And since the United States is a nation of immigrants, where people come from has an effect in American politics. I happen to think that's a good thing, but it's also a thing that's going to reinforce the strategic interests we talked about by the fact that you have this constant transnational flow of information back and forth between Indians who are living in America and Indians who are here. So I'm very optimistic.
Thank you. Shyam?
I think the problem with the India-US relations has been that, even though the glass is half full, we are constantly looking at the empty part of the glass, as we should, I think. But just in giving you a perspective, in 2005, the level of relationship that India and the United States had, if at that point of time somebody had told me that in 2015, the level of relationship between India and the US would be where it is today, I would have said it's not realistic. And yet we have actually journeyed very far. So I think while we should have expectations, while we should be looking for new things that we can do together, we should not forget that we have actually come quite a lot. The kind of depth and the breadth that the relationship has achieved over the last 10 years or so is actually quite a remarkable story. And I do not think that we should forget that remarkable story. And the second point I would like to make is that the most exciting thing I think which will happen is precisely what I think Gautam has indicated, that if the Indian growth story really takes off, if the kind of things that the present government wishes to do in terms of really making it easier to do business in India, I think the India-US business relationship will become a major driver of the overall relationship. I would certainly hope that we can go in that direction, because that seems to me one of the most promising things that is happening. And yes, no foreign investor will consider India a good risk if an Indian businessman does not consider India a good business risk. So it has to be all about creating a very conducive atmosphere for investment, for business in India. The rest, I think, will follow in terms of attracting US investment. So that is one of the most exciting things that can happen in the future.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, I'll echo a common theme here, and perhaps it's all because we've all been doing this for too long. But I first came to India just a little over 20 years ago with your predecessor, Peter Tarnoff, during the beginning of the Clinton administration. I was head of policy planning to inaugurate the first policy planning dialogue with the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. And if you want some measure of how far we've come, I could just give you the notes to those meetings, because the conversations were ideological, contentious, impractical and debating points. We all knew it was important to start that process, but it was discouraging. And again, as Sham said, if you had said to me 20 years ago that we would be where we are now with important differences, but practical, pragmatic, focused on things that we can do together, able to discuss our differences without pointing our fingers and calling names and labels, I would have said, you're dreaming. And so I think it is extraordinary how far we've come. And I also want to echo this point. I think, obviously, a lot of the attention gets focused on the government-to-government side. But I think we in the United States have to be very careful, especially on issues like the economic issues. The things we're talking about should not be done because they're a favor to the United States or they're being done as a concession to the United States. The things we're talking about are things that are good for India. They are good for Indian business, American business, the Indian people who need the opportunities to grow, become a more middle-class society. And it's very important as we Americans, and especially American officials, talk, is to make clear that this is not something that's kind of a high-level trade-off. I give you this, you win this one, I lose this one. But to think about it in those terms, about how together the kinds of things we're thinking about, and which the Prime Minister, I think, is thinking about, are things which are absolutely in the mutual interest of both, and that will be the success as to how we fill that second half of the glass.
Good. Captain?
I'm bullish. I mean, to think that you can go from being ambiguous about each other to talking about strategic allies in less than 10 years and a marriage that will last forever with squabbles, I think that's a paradigm shift. To be a little cheeky, I can ask this gentleman first, maybe he should constitute another panel and define to us what a paradigm shift would look like after all of this. And then I think we should be careful. I don't think you want too many paradigm shifts in the course of a relationship. we should be careful there. I could agree with everybody more. I think that we have to get our own act in order. And to me, the symbolic nature of the fact that President Obama is coming for the second time should not be lost on it. I mean, India has gone through a pretty difficult period of time in the last 3 years. We shouldn't forget that. The U.S. has had its own issue in that period of time. And when two countries are facing those kind of internal issues themselves, it is obvious that other small issues are going to crop up in a relationship. They just get more time and attention than what Sham says, which is the half of the glass that's empty. How do we fill that up? I think we've moved again. I think that this visit, I think the election of a new government, I think the focus of the new government in doing ease of business, I think will actually start filling up that half-empty part. And I think we will find new areas to cooperate in and new areas to get things going. But he's right. This is not a government-to-government issue. I don't think that the Indian government, at least it's my way of looking at it, is going to make any special concessions to any one country economically. Yeah. We have a domestic agenda. The government has a domestic agenda. We're trying to make sure that we align what we want for our domestic agenda to make you part of that agenda. But that part is the whole world of investors and not just U.S. investors. And that's the way you should look at it. And I think if we, at this level, can look at it that way, I think you let private capital will find its way. If it's going to make a return, it's going to find its way. So you don't worry about that.
Well, the reason I'm bullish on this relationship is because if you think about the great growth in it over the last decade or so, it's been produced by the BJP and Congress governments and by Republican and Democratic administrations in our two countries. And that is significant. Sham and I were together 10 years ago with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President Bush when the relationship really took off. And I'm gratified to see President Obama carry that forward. And he will do it when he's here on January 26th. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Thanks to all of you for being here. Wonderful.